Summer of 1944, a convoy grinds to a stop on a dusty American farm road. The men in the back of the truck, sunburnt and hollow-eyed, are German prisoners of war. They steel themselves for hard looks and harder work. The tailgate drops. They hop down, and the first thing they see is a row of mailboxes. Müller, Schneider, Braun, Krüger, names that could belong to their uncles. German names. On American soil, it's not what they expected. They had crossed an ocean to fight Americans and British and Canadians. But here, on a rural lane, they find something else entirely. A version of Germany that left decades ago, put down roots, and grew into something both familiar and foreign. This is the story of that shock, how it cracked open assumptions on both sides of a fence. The helmets and uniforms are gone here. What remains are calloused hands, ripening fields, and the strange intimacy of shared surnames. Let's start with the basics, because the scale alone is surprising. During World War II, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were brought to the United States. Camps were scattered across the map, from piney Alabama to the open prairies of Nebraska, from canneries in New York to citrus groves in Arizona. The reason was practical. With so many American men overseas, the country needed labor. America needed crops harvested, lumber milled, canneries staffed. And under the Geneva Convention, POWs could work, paid small wages, housed, fed, and guarded. On paper, it's simple. In practice, it's a collision of worlds. Imagine being a 19-year-old from Bremen, captured in North Africa or Normandy, now standing in Nebraska in front of a barn that looks suspiciously like something from your grandparents' village. Imagine hearing English spoken with a German lilt. Imagine a farmer's wife offering coffee and saying, in careful vintage German, Guten Morgen. For many prisoners, the journey began with trains to coastal ports, ships across the Atlantic, and then more trains and buses inland. The first shock arrived before they saw a single mailbox. It was the sheer abundance. Broad highways, long lines of freight cars, grain elevators rising like silos of promise. The United States during wartime looked, to them, like a country made of plenty. For men who'd survived bombings, ration books, and retreat, the bounty was startling. They wrote letters home, what letters the censors would allow, describing generous meals and clean barracks, and later, farm fields that went on and on. But abundance is one kind of revelation. The names on mailboxes were another, more intimate kind. The Midwest especially was thick with German surnames. The big waves of immigration in the 19th century had deposited entire communities of Germans, Catholics from Westphalia, Lutherans from Saxony, freethinkers from Baden, into the American heartland. They brought their church hymns, their dialects, their recipes. They named towns New Ulm, Frankenmuth, Germantown. By the 1940s, those descendants were Americans first, but the old names remained like fingerprints. So when the trucks pulled up, the prisoners craned their necks. Müller became Miller. Schneider sometimes stayed Schneider. Schmidt could be Smith or still Schmidt. They recognized the names, and in them recognized a thread that tied them to this strange land. It was unnerving. It was also disarming. If you had walked up the lane that first day, you might have heard a farmer say, almost apologetically, "My grandpa came over in 1881, spoke only German for 20 years. We used to hold church in German, but not so much now." And a prisoner might answer, relieved and wary all at once, "My Oma sang the same hymns." Then both would drift toward the rows of corn, unsure what to do with the bond that had just been laid between them. Work details were organized with care. Guards kept watch, but on farms the distance between people shrank quickly. Harvest doesn't wait for anyone, and work has a way of sanding down edges. The prisoners learned the rhythm. Early light, breakfast, marching to the fields, hoe in hand, sweat on the back of the neck, the smell of cut alfalfa and diesel. Payment came in canteen coupons. tokens they could spend on cigarettes, soap, maybe a chocolate bar. The farmer paid the government. The government credited the men. In those fields, words began to stretch across the gap. Some farmers spoke German, old dialects that sounded a bit like what the prisoners had heard as children, softened by time and a different continent. The prisoners spoke standard German, sprinkled with slang and soldiers' jargon. English seeped in at the edges. Crate, truck, lunch. It was not formal language learning. It was survival speech, and occasionally it was storytelling. One prisoner, let's call him Hans, was no more than 20. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. The farmer, Mr. Müller, was 55 with a back shaped by 40 harvests. They could have been family in another life. Hans noticed a framed photograph in the farmhouse, visible through the open door. A couple in stiff formal dress, the woman's bodice buttoned high, the man's mustache serious and precise. The caption read, in sepia ink, Johann and Elizabeth Müller, 1884. Hans asked, "From where?" Mr. Müller said, "Near Kassel, I think." "Hesse." Hans looked down. "My grandfather, too. Hesse." You could almost hear the math being done inside both heads. The Atlantic Ocean is wide, but it does not erase the way a loaf of bread is braided or the way a name fits in the mouth. Food was another shock. In wartime Germany, meals were measured and trimmed. Meat was occasional. Butter was precious. On these American farms, even with rationing, the table groaned. Eggs fried in bacon fat, thick slices of bread, coffee that wasn't chicory, sweet corn, pot roast on Sundays. There were rules. Prisoners were not allowed inside private homes in many jurisdictions, and guards enforced boundaries. But farmers could pass out apples at the edge of the field, or sip coffee on the back steps while the men took a break. The prisoners wrote about it, careful to avoid words that would be blacked out. "We will not go hungry here," one might say, which was both relief and a strange grief. Not every encounter was gentle. Some farmers had lost sons in Europe. Some had watched the newsreels of bombed London or learned about plots and atrocities. Suspicion hung in the air. German Americans had themselves endured suspicion during World War I. School names changed. Language classes dropped. Sauerkraut renamed Liberty Cabbage. In World War II, that pressure eased in some places and intensified in others. For a farmer with a German last name, employing German prisoners was both convenient and fraught. He wanted the crops in. He did not want to be accused of softness. So you had moments like this. A farmer holding out a water bucket, jaw tight, eyes like stone. A prisoner taking it, a little ashamed to accept kindness, silence heavy as a summer afternoon. And then, out of nowhere, laughter, because someone had mangled an English word into a perfectly ridiculous German sound. The ice cracked. Work resumed. There's a story told in different versions across different states. A prisoner stands at the edge of a field, watching a church steeple in the distance. The bell rings the hour. He begins to hum a hymn. Across the furrows, the farmer hears it and hums along a beat later. The melody is the same, but the accent is different. For a minute, the war shrinks until it is only a fence post wide. Church was, in some communities, the true bridge. Pastors who'd preached in German 30 years earlier dusted off their old Bibles. Some congregations welcomed prisoners for services. Some didn't. Where they did, the scene stuck with people. Men in simple work clothes sitting stiffly in pews, hats in hands, eyes darting between the stained glass and the floor, mouthing the words to Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, or Großer Gott, wir loben dich. A farmer's granddaughter remembered her grandmother slipping a prayer card with a German verse into a prisoner's hand and saying, "Keep this for when you go home." Camp life ran on rules. The Geneva Convention meant the men could write letters, receive packages, get medical care. They were supposed to be treated as soldiers, not criminals. Within those camps, something else happened too. Time. Time to think, read, argue. American authorities ran re-education programs in some camps, showing films, offering classes, inviting debates. In others, the camp hierarchy hardened, with ardent Nazis intimidating the less committed. On the farms, those edges softened. Work details often separated the ideologues from the pragmatists. A farmer didn't care about party membership. He cared about whether you showed up and worked the rows straight. There's a tension you can't ignore. In some regions, Black Americans and Mexican braceros worked the same fields, or nearby ones, and they watched white German prisoners ride out past them, wave to them, sometimes receive friendlier treatment from locals than they did. A German prisoner could be invited to a church picnic under supervision, while the black farmhand who'd lived there for years could not. It didn't happen everywhere, but it happened. Some prisoners noticed. They had been taught that America was weak, decadent, chaotic. What they saw was prosperity and contradiction. It made them ask questions, quietly at first, then out loud. At the cannery or the mill, the scene shifted. Instead of fields, there were crates and conveyor belts. Instead of sunrise, there were whistles and shift breaks. But even there, the names followed the men. Foremen who were the sons of immigrants called out instructions in English with German vowels. Stack them higher. Careful on the corners. Watch your hands, the prisoners learned quickly. They took pride in straight stacks, clean cuts, careful work. Pride is portable. It moves with you, even when your country has taken a beating. One afternoon, a farmer unlocked the tool shed and pulled out a box. Inside were letters written in the old script, Sutterlin, with its curling loops and elegant lines. "My father wrote these," he said, "from Illinois to his brother back in Bavaria." He wrote about the weather, about prices, about how the soil here was different. He handed one to a prisoner and asked him to read it aloud. The prisoner did, halting, stumbling over the ink-blotted words, his throat tight. The letter ended with a line. "Tell Ma the apple trees here are like candles when they bloom." The prisoner handed it back and said, "I didn't know America had apple trees like that." The farmer smiled. "You do now. Of course, there were rules about fraternization. You weren't supposed to trade. You weren't supposed to make friends. But humans are congenital line crossers in small, private ways. A farmer's wife might leave an extra jar of preserves at the end of the row by accident. A prisoner might swap a hand-carved toy he whittled in the barracks, an airplane, a little horse, for a photograph, just to hold it in his hand for a minute. Small contraband, small kindnesses, small risks. Once in a while, there were escape attempts. They make good stories because they're dramatic. A tunnel under a barracks, a stolen shirt, a bold dash, but most of the time, the escapes ended quickly, often with the prisoner turning himself in, cold and hungry, unsure where to go in a country this big. One notorious attempt involved a handful of men who made it all the way into the woods, lived on wild berries and luck, and then gave up at the first farmhouse, asking for a sandwich. "We tried," one said, shivering at the kitchen door. "It's too far to anywhere here." The farmer nodded, fed them, called the sheriff. The truth is, for many of the prisoners, there was little incentive to run. Waiting out the war in a place with hot meals and steady work was not the worst fate. The war's outcome became clearer as months passed. News arrived in murmurs. Bombs in Hamburg, Allied landings, the Eastern Front closing like a jaw. Some men hardened, others softened. A few found themselves laughing at jokes they would never have smiled at a year earlier. Jokes about American pie, jokes about clumsy boots, jokes about how, in America, even the barns looked prosperous. In the evenings, back in camp, the men argued. Politics seeped in like groundwater. Some kept faith with the collapsing regime. Others felt their faith dissolve as their bellies filled and their work made sense again. A guard might lean against the fence and chat. "What are you reading?" "Hemingway." "Who is that?" "An American writer." "Is he any good?" "Depends on whether you like short sentences." The men would nod. Short sentences can be a kind of mercy. One weekend, the farmer's daughter, 14 and curious, asked her mother a question kids have been asking since the beginning of time. "Why do they look like us?" Her mother answered simply, "Because we all come from somewhere else." The daughter thought about that. The next week, she put an apple in a paper sack and left it on the fence. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Another day, the prisoners saw a familiar object on a truck bed. An accordion. The farmer's neighbor had brought it for a barn dance. The prisoners watched from the road, guards on either side, as the farmer pumped the bellows and the notes floated up like Midwestern fireflies. One of the prisoners tapped his foot. He couldn't help it. The guards exchanged a glance. The farmer played a waltz. He didn't say it out loud, but the tune was from the old country. The music didn't know flags, it only knew the steps. If you listened at the right moment, you could hear a prisoner practicing English under his breath. "Thank you for the water. The weather is good. The corn is tall." You could hear a farmer practicing German. "Bitte. Ja. Heute ist es heiß." The words were not profound, but the effort was. Round the time the snow fell, the fields went bare and the work changed. Winter jobs took over, repairing fences, cleaning barns, hauling logs, sorting potatoes in cellars where the air smelled like earth. Holidays passed with a complicated gravity. Christmas in camp meant a tree in the mess hall and short, earnest speeches. A farmer might send over a sack of oranges, a rarity that felt like a miracle in winter. The prisoners sang Stille Nacht, and somewhere in the town, a church choir sang the same song in English, slow and reverent. Two languages, one melody, separated by a fence and a guard and an ocean's worth of misunderstanding. There were darker days, too. Not every guard was lenient. Not every farmer was kind. Insults were thrown. A thrown clod of dirt, a shove, a muttered threat. You could feel the war's sharp edges even here, dulled though they were by distance. News of concentration camps, of mass graves and ash, filtered in and landed like a sickness in the gut. Men stared at the floor, or stared back unblinking. Some stopped talking to each other entirely. Some sought out a pastor or a chaplain, anyone who would listen for 20 minutes without judgment. And yet, the daily work continued. There is something stubborn and relentless about agriculture. It demands attention, it punishes neglect, it rewards patience. In that routine, men found a rhythm their bodies understood. Lift, stack, haul, bend, reap. It made sense. For prisoners, the rhythm was a reprieve from chaos. For farmers, it was a way to make sense of the war. The world might be on fire, but there were still potatoes that needed sorting and calves that needed feeding. Letters carried the weight of two worlds. The censors read them first, heavy pencils hovering over sensitive words. The work is steady. We have enough to eat. I am thinking of home. Some men received news that tore them apart. A father gone, a house flattened, a sister missing. A farmer might see the slump in a man's shoulders and say nothing, and, in saying nothing, say everything. The next morning, the farmer would toss an extra biscuit into the lunch pail, quietly, like a prayer. As the war drew to a close, the air in camp changed. Rumors multiplied. Repatriation, transfers. Work details got shorter. Farewells began, practical and awkward. The farmer shook hands with the men who had picked his corn, hoed his beets, stacked his hay. The words were short. Thank you. Good luck. Safe trip. Some men promised to write. A few did. Thick envelopes arrived from Stuttgart or Hamburg 6 months later, full of meticulous handwriting, photographs of rubble, and a line or two about missing the wide sky. A handful of former prisoners eventually returned, this time with visas, to marry, to work, to become Americans. Not as many as legends suggest, but enough to matter. They settled in little towns with main streets that looked like quilts sewn from brick and hope. They opened bakeries and carpentry shops. They raised children who would giggle when Grandpa pronounced squirrel like a German fairy tale character. The memory of the shock, those mailboxes, those surnames, never left them. Decades later, you can still find a photograph in a county museum. A line of men standing shoulder to shoulder in work shirts, some with guard caps in the background, all squinting into the sun. On the back, in faint pencil, a list of names. Some English, some German. The caption reads, Harvest Crew, 1944. If you run your finger along the list, you'll feel the seam where countries met and didn't quite fit, but stayed together anyway, like mismatched boards held by a steady hand and a good nail. The shock ran both ways. For the prisoners, it was discovering Germany in America. Family names, familiar hymns, the accent of a grandmother on a stranger's tongue. For the farmers, it was discovering how quickly you could recognize yourself in a supposed enemy. The line between us and them, drawn in war, blurred under the weight of daily life. The temptation is to turn this into a simple moral. We are all the same. But that flattens the texture too much. People aren't the same. They are complicated. They carry lagers and grudges and jokes and fears. The real lesson, if there is one, sits in the quieter shadows. It's in the way a man hands a canteen to another man without asking for a pledge. It's in the way a hymn finds a throat across a field. It's in the way a name on a mailbox can trip up your heart, shock you, disarm you, and then invite you to look closer at what identity really means in a place like America. What struck the prisoners most, after that first jolt of recognition, was how ordinary it all felt. The smell of fresh-cut hay, the creak of a windmill, the clink of enamel mugs, and here and there, a word in German rising from a porch like a sparrow. Mittag! Kommt, essen! Not shouted at them, not barked. Just life, happening, in a language they knew. They weren't expecting that. They had been told Americans were soft, crude. A prisoner cleared his throat. Yes, we do. Then maybe today we'll go faster, he said. We'll start with the beats. I'm Schneider, your foreman. And don't worry, my wife won't let you starve. The men exchanged glances. A joke, a human one. It softened something they hadn't realized was clenched. The work was simple, honest, and hard. Rows ran like sentences across the ground. Pick, load, wipe sweat, repeat. And in the rhythm, words began to bridge the gap. Where are you from? Hesse? Hesse? My father came from Kassel, the farmer said. He tapped his chest. Schneider, he smiled. My mother said she learned English with a German accent. One of the prisoners, Karl, laughed despite himself. He hadn't laughed in months. He looked out across the field at a line of boys detasseling corn. One wore suspenders too long for his frame, another a cap too big. They looked like cousins at harvest. At noon, they sat under a cottonwood. The farmers passed tin pails, sandwiches thick with liverwurst, a jar of pickles, an apple pie that looked like autumn. The farm wife handed cups around and nodded. Bitte schön, she said, with a Scottish lilt tucked inside the German. Karl stared at the pie. You bake like my mother, he said. The wife smiled. I learned from mine. That afternoon, the pace settled. Questions crept in with the breeze. How long until the war ends? Do you miss home? Do you like baseball? Do you know football? A boy named Eddie, freckles scattered like seed, kicked the dirt. We play baseball Saturdays by the elevator, he said. You can watch if the guards say yes. He hesitated. Or play if you want. We can teach you. We can show you football, Karl said. The boy brightened. Deal. In the days that followed, surprises stacked up like crates. The first surprise, language. The POWs discovered that in some kitchens and barns, German wasn't a foreign language at all. It was the language of recipes and lullabies, of church and chores. It had survived migrations and wars, thinned by time, softened by English, but alive. Yet it sounded different enough to make them grin. "You're from Swabia?" asked a prisoner from Hamburg, struggling through a farmer's molasses-thick vowels. "No," said the farmer, grinning. "I was born in Iowa. My Oma was from Swabia." They met Pennsylvania Dutch speakers whose Deutsch sounded like a song from the 1700s. They met Volga Germans whose vowels carried the cold of the steppes. They met Lutherans and Catholics, pacifist Mennonites who disapproved of the war, and Presbyterians who did not speak German but still made sauerkraut every fall. The second surprise: food. Not just pie, not just sandwiches. There were kuchen and braided loaves at Christmas. There was sausage that snapped, dill pickles crisp as a winter morning, and coffee that tasted like forgiveness. Many POWs had not had a full stomach in years. It unnerved them to find abundance here, and stranger still, to be invited to share it. "You treat prisoners like this?" one asked, confused, sipping hot coffee in a kitchen full of sunlight. "We treat workers like people," the farmer's wife said simply. "Anyway, my mother would haunt me if I sent men back to the field hungry." The third surprise: pay. The men were handed chits at day's end, coupons good at the camp canteen for soap, writing paper, cigarettes, sometimes a small radio shared in a barrack-like treasure. It felt absurd and wonderful to stand in line to buy chocolate with American coupons while a war raged an ocean away. "Do they really pay you?" Eddie asked, incredulous. "Yes," Carl said, holding up the little scrip. "Not much, enough to buy a bar of chocolate." He broke it and held half toward the boy. Eddie hesitated. Then he took it. The fourth surprise: church bells. On Sundays, permission granted, the men marched down a gravel road past silos to a white church, with a steeple that pointed like a finger at heaven. The sign said St. Paul's. The hymns, for one service a month, were in German. The pastor, an American in a black robe, smiled at the prisoners as they slid into pews. "We sing the same songs," he said quietly to the first row. "God hears your mother's voice when you sing. He knows where you learned it." When the organ swelled with Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, some men closed their eyes, some did not. Some stared, hard, at the stained glass, fighting a war inside themselves that had nothing to do with maps. Not everything harmonized. Not everything healed. There were hard men among the prisoners, and hard words in the night. There were bruises hidden under sleeves, politics argued in whispers, intimidation that flickered at the edges of the barracks like fire. There were sharp looks from townsfolk who saw only the uniforms and the past. There were letters from home that tasted like salt. Brother missing, father gone, a city ground to dust. But there were also small, disarming moments that kept happening, stubborn as dandelions. A farmer asked a prisoner to mend a tractor seat. The prisoner, a cabinet maker before the war, did it so well the farmer ran his hand over the leather twice, like he was petting a dog. "That's fine work," he said softly. "Here." He pressed something into the man's palm. 3 canteen coupons. A fortune! A little girl ran up to the fence with a ribbon and thrust it through. It was blue, sky blue. "For luck," she said. The men carved toys from scrap wood on their off hours and handed them to farm kids through the wire. Little horses with tails made of string, a tiny boat that actually floated, a top that spun so well it seemed like a lie. Sometimes the soft collisions stung. A prisoner named Rudy stood outside a cafe, waiting to be marched in for a rare treat, pie on a Saturday after a long harvest. He noticed a black man waiting by the side door, hat in hand. When the group entered the main dining room, the man stayed outside. Rudy glanced back, searching the guard's face for explanation he would not get. Inside, a waitress poured coffee into white cups and smiled at the men who had once pointed weapons at her country. Outside, the man tugged his hat. Later, back at the farm, Rudy asked the farmer's wife in quiet German, "Why?" Her face fell. She took a breath and did not reach for simple words. "We are still learning who we are," she said. In the evenings, when the sun backed down and the dust settled, the prisoners played soccer in the camp yard. The ball thunked against boots. Guards leaned on rifles and watched with a kind of boredom that wasn't unkind. Occasionally, a farmer's son stared through the fence and mimicked the kicks, getting the angle wrong but the joy right. Once, after a long game that left everyone grinning and exhausted, Eddie's friend shouted, "Play us next week." The men nodded. "You bring a baseball," one said. "We'll trade. The swap happened." They took the field behind the elevator. The rules were explained in wild hand signals and broken language. The first grounder skipped past 3 gloves. A stolen base prompted a debate so passionate it felt like church. By the end, nobody could tell who had won, because something else had. The myth of the stranger had cracked. Word traveled. As it does in towns, the prisoners were good workers, better behaved than some, eager to return the following day because it meant a break from monotony. They were efficient with beats, gentle with horses, deft with tools, quick with numbers. A teacher in town brought a few paperbacks to the camp. Twain, Steinbeck, a Germany history written in English. The men read with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. One afternoon, under a sky big enough to hold all their contradictions, the farmer named Schneider motioned to Karl. "I know a man who carves," he said. "I hear you do too. My father taught me," Karl replied. "Show me," said Schneider. They walked to a barn where a broken beam was wrapped with wire. Karl studied it, measured with his hands, and began. The saw sang. The years fell away. He forgot the war. He remembered sap and light. When he finished, the barn smelled new again. Schneider nodded, approving but quiet. "My father would have liked you," he said. A week later, a letter arrived at the farm. It had come through censors and stamps, across oceans and rails. The envelope was thin, the paper thinner. Schneider's wife read it, lips moving. She took it to the camp. "For you," she said to Karl, holding it through the fence. His hands shook as he unfolded the page. He read. The words were a lighthouse and a storm. Mother alive. Brother captured. City blackened. A cousin married in a dress. When the war in Europe ended, the news came like thunder rolling from the horizon. Some cheered. Some felt only relief. Some stared at the ground, knowing that an ending can also be the beginning of a long uncertainty. For many, the journey home would not be straight. They would be sent from American fields to British or French ones for more labor before they saw their own rooftops. Papers were signed. Trunks were packed. Goodbyes gathered in throats like dry bread. On the last day at the farm, the prisoners stood awkwardly by the truck. Schneider approached with his wife and children. The little girl, ribbon now faded, held something behind her back. The farmer spoke first. "You worked well. You kept your word. If you can, write." He hesitated. "If you ever come back, this road will still be here." The little girl thrust her gift forward. It was a photograph of the family, stiff and proud, with the barn behind them. She had written in careful letters on the back, "For Karl. So you remember us." He swallowed. "I won't forget," he said. The road rattled under the tires. The truck turned the bend. The mailboxes, Müller, Schneider, Braun, Krüger, vanished behind dust. Years passed. Years always do. In Germany, Karl found a country stumbling back to its feet. He laid his father to rest, fixed windows, found work where he could. He thought of the farm on late afternoons when the light fell a certain way, of the ribbon, the pie, the barn. He wrote a letter, then another. Sometimes weeks passed, sometimes months, but the letters got through. In Iowa, a farmer's wife checked the mailbox. She opened an envelope with unfamiliar stamps and a familiar hand. She read it aloud to the supper table, tears threatening, and then held back. He was alive. He was working. He asked about the corn, about the boy with the cap too big. He asked if the dog still slept under the porch. He enclosed a photograph of himself standing by a rebuilt door frame, plane in hand, smiling in a way he didn't realize he was. The boy with the cap was not a boy anymore when another letter came with a question. Could I return? Not now, not soon, but someday. Paperwork, sponsorship, a promise to work hard. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for a chance. The farmer read the letter twice. He folded it. He unfolded it. He looked at his wife. She nodded. They sent affidavits. The kind you sign with a hand that knows a plow. Years later, a ship eased into New York Harbor, and a man stepped onto a pier with a small suitcase and a breath he hadn't exhaled in a long time. On a platform in a station in the Midwest, he looked for one face and found three: a farmer, a wife, and a now-grown man who had once eaten chocolate at a fence. "Welcome back," said the farmer. It didn't feel like back. It felt like forward. He worked. He was good at it. He saved. He learned more English. He still prayed in German sometimes, and the pastor said that was fine. He married a girl from a town over whose grandparents had come from Alsace. The ribbon lived in a drawer for a long time, then in a frame on a wall. The photograph of the family sat on a mantel, and the smile in it taught him many times how to use his face. When he got his papers, he held them like a baby. The clerk at the courthouse congratulated him. On the drive home, they passed a row of mailboxes. Müller, Schneider, Braun, Krüger. He laughed. He could not help it. The circle was almost too neat. There are so many stories like his, and as many that aren't, because history does not march in a straight line. Some men never came back. Some did and turned north, south, east, west. Some returned home and stayed there, building a life from rubble, never speaking of the camp, never wanting to. Some farmers kept the letters in shoeboxes. Some burned them when the pain of remembering outgrew the comfort. Some children told their grandchildren that the men from across the ocean were kind and strange and very good at soccer. And what of the shock on that first day? The jolt at the mailboxes? It faded. It remained. Both are true. The surprise became a story told and retold at tables. You won't believe this. Our prisoners were named almost exactly like us. People laughed, then fell quiet, then nodded at the way the world sometimes makes a point with a sledgehammer and sometimes with a feather.